everyone, my name is Vehmeier,
And my name is Grant Moest.
and we are partners in High Plains Grains, and today we are here to share with you our experiences from the 2019 season and growing CBD hemp and what that looked like for us. We're going to give you a breakdown on the steps involved in the process and how we went about it. We went about it in a very mechanized fashion, so we can speak to that end of things for the most part, and we'll give it to you straight on everything, the good, the bad, and kind of everything in between. Okay, so getting into it, there's a few items on the pre-plant checklist you need to go through. Beyond just budgeting and figuring out whether hemp is for you or not, you have to get down to it and pick out a field. So speaking on the field selection side of things, there are some key things that we learned from 2019, what hemp likes, what it doesn't. As you can see in the video, we're doing some tillage, getting ready for the field, getting it ready to plant. As you can see, it's a very flat, very black, deep topsoil field. And in hindsight, that does not bode well for hemp if you run into what we had last year, which was a very wet year. We came to find out that hemp does not like wet feet, and it's critical that you can get the water off of the soil. If you do run into a lot of rain, do it quickly to prevent disease from setting in the plants. So when it comes to field prep, you're going to want to probably lean towards soil that's a little rockier, a little sandier, has some solid slope on it, it drains well, and if you can always irrigate after the fact, but if you can't get the water off it, it's really going to throw a wrench into things. So really be cognizant of what you're going into for the field you pick out, and if it's going to be the best fit for hemp. You just kind of watch this right here, and then on the field that you do pick, we're talking about soil prep. Some big things to remember. We did a direct seeding, so we were planting very small seeds directly into the ground, and so some big things to make sure you have ready to go ground wise is that soil is nice and tilthy on the top. It's not crusted at all. There's no large clods because they're very small seeds. If you have a lot of clodding at the top layer, it can cause air pockets and issues with your germination. So another key is that whatever you do, whether tillage you do, just make sure that the ground is pretty well conditioned to go into direct seed with.
Unless you're going to do a no-till route, then try and leave the soil as undisturbed as possible so that your planter can make a adequate seed trench for that little seed to drop into.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so moving on now, I'll have Grant take the wheel here and go ahead and explain kind of the planting side of things.
This year we decided to do direct seed. It was the most economical way for us to get our 60 acres of hemp in the ground. We chose to buy a Norseman film planter and plant our 60 acres with that. The planter it's a basic John Deere planter with XP row units on it and outfitted with all your precision planting gizmos. The only thing special about this planter is the film apparatus on the back that you see laying down the film. It lays down a translucent cornstarch based film that is supposed to biodegrade within 12 weeks. The idea behind this is to kind of give it a greenhouse effect over the seed trench, draw moisture, create heat, get better germination. The equipment, you go out, you prep your field a little different. You make sure you have a really nice tilled field, and then you have a nice really level field for the plastic to lay down. You don't do anything in terms of any special way you run the planter, just functions just like any other planter, putting seeds in the ground. You watch your 20/20 monitor. If you have a 20/20 monitor, you're familiar with that. But other than that, it's a pretty easy process. We chose to go fairly slow. I would say our average speed when we were planting was anywhere from 1.5 miles to 2.5 miles an hour. That's kind of where the planter performed really well. I had a really good time with getting the seeds to singulate. For the majority of it, I had it to singulate 100%. And we saw that on the back end of stuff when we start to see emergence. So I was very pleased with the performance of the planter, and I was pleased with the performance of the film apparatuses as well. we chose to delay planting dates to June. We talked to some people ahead of time that said, do not plant early. Your plants will get very, very tall. They will get big like you want, but then that makes them very prone to wind and rain and breakage, which I think a lot of us did experience. So the days we planted on June 10th and June 11th, we planted about half and half. We had to have quite a few people around to help with this film laying process. You needed people on each ends of the fields to cover up the end of the plastic so the wind didn't catch it and start to rip it up. You needed people riding on the planter to watch the film rows to make sure we weren't, getting tears or they weren't starting to lay crooked, and making sure that the discs were throwing dirt over the edge of the things right there. So it is a much more labor intensive planter than your typical corn or soybean planter, but other than when we break it down to the mechanics, it is just like your corn and soybean planter for the most part, other than the exception of that film on the back. Going into next year, I would not use film again. Back to with, we planted in June. It was plenty warm and it was plenty wet then. This was kind of an insurance thing this year. From what we saw, the way the plants behaved, the way when we left areas blank, the way we saw germination there versus when we saw germination on the end rows, I don't think the film was necessary. But that all depends on kind of where you're at. We have some pretty black, active soils that we planted into here. So we have good biology, and I think that biology really helped with our germination. So I personally would not use film again in the future, but that does not mean it's not applicable for some other people and elsewhere with different soils. So I think this planter has its place. It just was not here in our operation. Seed prep. For seed prep, we scar and inoculate the seed. Scar to kind of break the hull, to kind of give it a chance to kind of imbibe water a little better, and then inoculate to kind of give it some biology as well to get a better germination. One thing, sometimes people forget that in the greenhouse settings that they also scar and inoculate. If they just put straight hemp seeds into their soil medium and start them in there, they could also see a very low germ, like some people experienced this year as well. But those guys do different type of seed prep, and I don't think everybody was always aware of that. We weren't aware of it until about the last second. So operating this planter, it was fairly easy to operate. I didn't have too many issues with it. It's just slow going. You got to take your time. We wanted to make sure the plastic was laying straight, making sure the seeds were dropping right underneath the slits in the film. We had pretty good luck with that. I would say sometimes on the side hills they had a tendency to kind of shift, but for the most part, most of our plants were right under the middle, and they did pretty good. We had a very small measurable percentage that weren't right under the side there, but back again, this is mechanized. This is not going to be perfect, so I was able to live with that. Other than that, there's not a lot of cons to the direct seeding. We had very good luck with it, and I would continue to direct seed for the seasons coming forward here. I would honestly say if you have a precision outfitted planter with electric drives and hydraulic downforce, you don't even need hydraulic downforce, but if you have electric drives and a 2020, this is something you can use on your already existing equipment. You can talk to Precision, or you can talk to a local precision dealer about what you need for meter internals and to get you set up to run hemp seed properly into there. So after this, I'm going to turn it over to Ben and let Ben talk about in-season management.
Yeah, so as you can see, we're getting into the field here. This is about 30 days post-plant. The field, as you can see, looks relatively clean. You got a few little patches here and there of some weeds and some grasses coming in. So one of the big areas in season with CBD hemp, because you have to grow it to organic standards, you can't be spraying pesticides, herbicides, or anything else like that out there in season, and you have to raise it organically. You really limit yourself with what you have for options available for weed management, pest management, disease management, all of that stuff. But the biggest one really when it comes to this is weed management. Do you have a plan in place where you can stay ahead of it and stay on top of it? So one thing that really saved us last year, a combination of things that really helped us on the weed management side of things. Early season, what really saved us As you can see in this video, that's a very clean field, 30 days post-plant. Very few people around who also grew hemp had even close to as clean of a field as that long post-plant. And it's not because we were out there just weeding everything that first came up. We have yet to have a crew out here to weed yet. What the difference here is and why it's so clean is that we had on this 60 acres an oat cover crop that we seeded in early April of the spring that year. And that oat crop got, probably 6 to 8 inches tall before we finally terminated it, tilled it under, and then prepped the field as you see here, and then went ahead and planted. So we came to find out though that oats as a cover crop, and why we want to use it moving forward in the spring, is that oats roots, they release a certain chemical that has an allelopathic effect with weeds. So oats are actually a good tool to hold weeds back for, you can roughly count on, typically 3 weeks of that allelopathic effect kind of maintaining strength in the field. So as you can see, like I said, we're 30 days post-plant, and we were very, very happy to see the field still this clean, because everyone knew we were getting rain from the word go all last summer. So all the moisture we had, the heat, we were just very nervous that we were just going to get overrun with weed before we even knew what to do with it. But the oats really saved us early season, because you can't see down in the furrow right now, but there are hemp plants out of the ground here. They're about, anywhere from 3 to 4, 6 inches tall so far, but they're just in the very early stages yet. But that was key. That first month, we feel, is very key to keeping the weed pressure back, because if the weeds get ahead of you, it can become a problem when you actually start to get emergence. Because one thing that's very different in the hemp game compared to the corn and soy and your other commodities is that the genetics have a long way to go to catch up to where we're getting that perfect emergence, same day emergence, all the things we're used to seeing in traditional corn and soy production. But they have decades longer of experience on the genetic side, and so there's some catching up to do on the hemp side. So one thing we had to combat was the emergence, and the fact that it took anywhere from 20 to 30 days for the field to emerge, and it came up in different waves. It was not all even, and you didn't have all the same phenotypes popping up, because again, it comes back to good genetics that you're purchasing as well. But if you can give that early season break and you can keep them weeds down and let them plants get out of the ground, we did watch, once the hemp gets up and it hits that rapid growth stage, there is no weed that will compete with that, because they grow insanely fast, anywhere from 6 to 8 inches a day. And at that point, that's when the plants just really get going. And then the weed management, you just have to make sure you don't let patches and big ones really take over, and then just keep the plants somewhat clean. But again, it's not perfect. If we were using herbicides, things like that, yeah, you'd have an even cleaner field. But early season, we were definitely pleased with this. As we get through the video, you'll see that the weed management, after a certain point, we just had to do what we had to do, because we had, drowned out spots, grass patches coming on, and you got to make some tough decisions at a certain point. Is it worth going through and getting every last weed, or keeping the bulk of the field intact? And that's the route we ultimately took. So you'll kind of see as the video goes on that it wasn't this clean. But early season, that's one big thing we wanted to bring up. Going into weed management then, what are the different methods and equipment you can use? I will say what we used was good old-fashioned hand labor. Get the garden hose out and get a crew going and start walking rows, keeping weeds away from the plants, and pulling any big ones. It's not ideal, but it was really what we only had the choice to do, given that we planted the way we did. I knew that there was a few people out there last year who did some mechanized form of weeding. I saw a couple of those like seated, mechanized hand weeder things that you pull behind a tractor. I don't really know much about them, how well they work. I can't speak to that experience, but I do know that they're out there, so it's something to look into if you're looking at mechanizing it a little further than this. This was the one piece that really sucked about the whole thing, was having to hand weed everything. But this is why, kind of getting back to why we also want to go away from the film this year, is because it really limits you in terms of what you can do on that, because that plastic, it's it's biodegradable. It's not like this really tough stuff where it won't rip or anything. I mean, it'll rip easy, but when you talk about running any sort of rototillers or weed whippers, any sort of mechanized tools that we're used to using, the plastic just became a headache and just would always get wrapped up in it, and we just came to the realization that it was too much of a headache to deal with, and we didn't really see what the purpose of it on the front side, which was increased germination. We didn't see that to the extent that we believed, had we not had the film, would we have gotten the same germ. So to clarify, I mean, I think that the germ would have been the same regardless of if that film was there or not, mainly because, and Grant probably previously mentioned, because of the fact that we're planting in June, we have warm soil temps. This is a region where we have good organic matter. Seeds can get started on their own. The transplanting model and stuff is much more suited towards out west, where they really don't have a lot of live soil or really active soil, and it's much easier for them to go ahead and start things in a greenhouse and transplant, and in order to ensure that they're going to get good germination. But because we're in the Midwest, because we grow pretty much any crop we can, with the good soils we have, we felt that direct seeding is the way to go, and you don't need plastic to get them started. But that's just our opinion. That's our take on it, and we're just sharing, our lessons from this year and why we felt that way. So that's kind of all there on weed management. Moving on to disease management. Really the biggest ones to deal with. I don't really have any footage of each specific disease, but we did see some disease in our field this year. The main one being blight. You've got a little bit of blight that set in. Basically, when you have excessive moisture, and there's moisture that sits on the leaves of the plants, that breeds bacteria, and then you get this a little bit of mold can set in, or you see it's called like brown leaf spot. A lot of people probably remember from this year, they saw their plants, they had leaves that looked like it, just like little brown droplets on them, and then they just sat there. We came to find out that was the brown leaf spot disease, and that's probably one of the most common, top 3-4 most common diseases. And then you've got, just your typical bud rots, where you'll see once you get into the flowering stage of the season, you'll see the buds, and the very tips of them will be either a little soft or kind of brown, and so that's called bud rot. And if you have that setting in a big way, that's not so good. We saw it in little areas here and there, so for the most part we were able to stay away from it. But again, we had just a record rainfall year again, and so it just really wasn't the best year to say, I'm going to have a totally disease-free field. It's just, it is what it is. But kind of those are the most common ones on disease side, and Philip's got a lot more information on that side of things, and other resources there too. So we won't speak too much on that. Same goes for insect management. The most common pests we saw, which was really in line with most everybody else, was your corn borer. There's a hemp borer. We saw those here and there in the field. Basically, whenever it would get real wet and rain for a bunch of days and then the sun come out, we'd see them flare up. And then if it would dry out at all, we'd see it kind of die down some. But, those were the big ones we saw this year, was the corn borer. Yeah. So for insects wise, again, Philip would be a very good resource on that if you want to learn more about that. And then the other big thing in season is fertility. So there's two ways you can go about getting your nutrients out there. We feel strongly that it's important to feed these plants, either weekly, bi-weekly during the season. Kind of the jury's still out if it needs to be a shot every 3 weeks, or if it's weekly is better. Whatever it is, we believe that in-season nutrient management and feeding is very important to raising a quality crop. Number one from a yield side, but what you're doing too is setting it up for success on the disease and preventing some of these things from setting in. Because again, if you don't have chemicals you can rely on to kill weeds or kill off a disease, with the fungicide, you have to rely on that plant being able to build its own, immune system, if you will, against some of this stuff. And the only way you do that is through feeding it what it needs, and building its resiliency that way. So as we mentioned earlier, the Foliar program we used this year, as we see here, we're getting into a spraying. Like we said, the nutrients are important, keeping the plants resilient. So what we did this year, our program we did not start the first feeding until about week 7, when the plants were anywhere from 6 to 10 inches tall, roughly. And we started feeding basically the same thing we put down with the planter. It was CX1 mixed with Boost. CX1 is your biological product from, we sourced ours from Purple Cow Genetics this year, like many others did. And then we used Boost along with it, and Boost is just a simple sugar. And what Boost is, number one, it activates the CX1, but then also feeding simple sugars to plants can raise their Brix level, and that's one of another way of guys go about insect management is if you get the Brix level high enough in your plants, a lot of insects or pests cannot process simple sugars. So what ends up happening is they don't attack those plants as much because the plant's Brix level has been high enough. So that's why the Boost is in there, and that's why it's with the CX1, because it also activates that and the biologicals there. So speaking to that, as you can see, we're filling up the sprayer here with our mixes. We decided to go a foliar method this year. Really, there's 2 main methods people go about this. They either spray it foliar like we're doing here, or the other method is fertigation, where you put in a drip line system and then you feed it through the drip line. In hindsight, and after talking to a lot of people, experienced growers in the industry, during the season, it sounds like that fertigation is probably the way to go, because what's unique about hemp a little bit is that they're very, very good plants at uptaking nutrients through their roots. It's well known, a lot of people talk about it's that they are soil remediators, and they take in things through their roots very well. So kind of the idea with fertigation is you feed the roots and then it'll take it into the plant, versus what we did was foliar, which obviously a topical application, you're spraying it over the top. It's a good way of going about it. It just kind of depends what your equipment setup is, but I think as we move forward, we'd like to transition more towards a fertigation system, because of the fact that what you can run into when you do foliar and you're spraying is regardless of if it's biological or not, it is moisture that you're introducing onto the leaf tissue, and if that sits there and gets trapped, it's a good breeding ground for bacteria to start new disease. So we can find out from other experienced growers, just feeding it through the roots really helps it out the best, because again, you want to keep these plants dry and and healthy. As you can see, the field's finally green. You can no longer see, it doesn't look like just straight topsoil, so we do have plants out there, but as I mentioned earlier, I said it did not stay that clean through the whole season. You can see, we by this point had probably had well over a foot of rain since planting, and as you can see, the grass patches came on pretty strong. That's where we got to the point where it just, we manage as best we can, but if we lose some patches here or there, is what it is. It's just, at the end of the day, if you're doing to scale and what you have for labor, you got to take all that into account and not try to beat yourself up so much about saving every last plant or every last flower, because again, we farm in the Midwest, we're used to mechanical loss and things of that nature, because again, we're trying to scale while still maintaining quality, but also trying to scale at the same time, because we're trying to feed a larger market. So take all that stuff into account. What's your situation, what's going to work best for you. But I mean, this is what we did last year, and just spraying, it went pretty well. It was a pretty seamless process. We just marked out our rows and our spacing, and nothing fancy, just an old John Deere sprayer. We went and bought this, and the reason why we went that is because the body was narrow enough to fit between the rows, and it had a high enough clearance for us to get through the bulk of the season. Because we did this program, it was a 7-week program. We did once weekly feeding, just like this. We did it right up until basically the first week of flowering. Once we started to see some flowers on the plants, that's when we cut out. That was something that was a suggestion from the seed suppliers themselves. They say once it's into flower, it's best for the flower sake, disease-wise, not to keep spraying it. Even if it's a biological product, it's just the flowers are the flowers, and you don't want to mess those up once they're out. So that's kind of when we decided to stop, and that sprayer just happened to work out pretty well because of the clearance and the body's narrow enough to fit the rows. It worked out pretty good. But again, we'll probably like to move towards fertigation over time, but just depends on what you got available to you. As you can see here, we have the helicopter in the field. It's not spraying anything different than what we were spraying before with our ground sprayer. It's just we ran into an issue where we did run out of room with the sprayer where the plants did get too tall. So we had to come back and make our last feeding, and we just hired the company that we do some other work with on corn and beans to go ahead and apply the last feeding of the foliar spray. So that's all that's going on there. Just wanted to clarify that before we move on.
So my name is Ross Vehmeier from Green Harvest Solutions. We are a mechanical specific harvester located in Lena, Illinois. 2019 season was a big learning curve for us. We took a lot of different ideas from a lot of different places in the country. We worked with a equipment broker and kind of put together a pretty solid plan to be as efficient as possible in the harvest process. So the stripper method leaves behind the fiber that you're not going to want to deal with in the biomass anyway. So it takes the stuff that you get paid for and it leaves the stuff you don't in the field. Takes a little field cleanup after the fact, but we're here to harvest for oil. At least that was our goal in 2019. And this is what we found to be the most effective method. We do also offer a whole plant option, meaning we would take the whole plant. There are times when we have to use this. If you have, down plants, or we had an early snow and it knocked the branches off of your Christmas trees, is what I like to call them, because that's about what they look like by the time we get to the point we're going to harvest them. The whole plant chop seems to be the best option, just because the stripper works most effectively when the plants are upright, in kind of good standing position, and it requires that to actually feed through the header. If they're falling down, we'll have a discussion and say, hey, we really should be whole plant chopping this. It adds more stem stalk into the biomass, but it gets the crop out of the field. I guess the next thing to talk about here is what we do with the biomass. So our model is based upon taking it from the field, homogenizing it in the field, and from there taking forage boxes away from the chopper and taking them to the baler. So the baler in 2019 was a very controversial item. A lot of people didn't believe in the bales. There was a lot of discussion about whether or not they were the right way to handle hemp. I went to a lot of meetings where people were like, oh, I'd never put, my hemp in a bale, blah, 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 blah. And I'm here to tell you that in 2019, we proved a lot of people wrong. We opened a bale the other day, 6-month-old bale, and it is fresh as a daisy and as green as it was the day it went in. So there's a couple key ingredients here. You can't just take any old New Holland drum style baler and think that you can bale hemp. There are no balers that exist today that allow you to bale in the field. The only thing that has enough bar rating is basically a compactor. Last year we used an Oracle, Norwegian company. It can bale at a pressure rating of up to 300 bar of pressure. It's about 4,800 psi. That's the key. The pressure does a few things. So when you harvest hemp, you create essentially a chemistry set in your forage box, or in your bag, or on the floor of your shop if you're whole plant harvesting. If you're doing it by hand, just remember this plant is going to heat up on you. There's a lot of chemistry here. The chemistry is what pays the bills, so you got to know how to handle that. So I heard people last year talking about putting their forage boxes into freezers, or trying to do whatever they could to keep things clean or cold. In our opinion, the best way to stop a fire is to take away the oxygen, and that's a pretty common practice, and that's exactly what the baler does. The forage box is unloaded hydraulically, chain drive, into the back of the baler. The baler then conveys all of the biomass material at a very fast rate. We can produce a 1,600 to 2,000 pound bale every minute. Pretty much as fast as we can feed biomass in, we can kick bales out, and you'll see that in the video here. But the key is that pressure. So at the minimum, if you are thinking about baling or thinking about buying a baler or a compactor, you want to make sure that there is at least 220 bar of pressure. The balers that exist that do this today that I'm aware of are Oracle, Camel, and there are other brands, but I'm not sure they meet the pressure density rating. So the key there is we compact them, we put a heavy plastic wrap around the outside of the bale first to hold the bale together, and then we do at least 6 layers of plastic around the outside to keep air away from the surface of the bale. So a few questions about the bale. I kind of touched on this already. You know, how much do they weigh? They're very heavy. They're 1,600 pounds was about our field average last year. We baled about 700 bales. So 1,600 pounds is pretty chunky for a 4x4 bale. Completely wrapped. And the other piece is you want to make sure that they're stored the right way. Do not store them on gravel. Do not let them roll out on gravel. Make sure that you treat them as fragile as if they were eggs. So one of the things also that we found with bales is occasionally, due to operator error or, you know, snagging on the deck of a semi or whatever, you have a rip. Don't freak out. They can be fixed. Basically, you want to buy bale tape and you want to have it available if you are going to store bales. Something could happen. Someone could back into them. Someone could drop something on them, etc., etc. They can be fixed pretty easy. Little bale tape, and just keep the oxygen away from them, and you'll be fine. So, you know, once you have everything baled up, stored, ready to go, you're in a good place. And the thing about the bale that's important is it gives you time to get to the next step. So, you know, 2019, we were talking about going to the next step, which was drying. 2020, it could be drying, it could be right to an extractor that has a wet or an aqueous option, etc., etc. The bale is the intermediary to get you out of the field when the weather is right, which, by the way, that's the hardest part, and to get you to a processing plant where they don't need the weather to be right, they're under roof, etc., etc., and they have a lot to process, and they don't have to do it the same day that it comes out of the field. The baler gives us time. It's a food saver. If you look at the hemp biomass as food, it's a food saver. It stops the heat, it stops any degradation, it preserves the material, and for 2019 it was a lifesaver. So a couple things about the bales. Like I said, they're 4x4, approximately 1,600 pounds. Last year, 2019 season, was a very, very wet year. We had about 15 days of actual solid harvest opportunity. The challenge, as I probably don't need to tell anybody, is that it was so wet that it was A, hard to get in the field, B, we couldn't get our moisture where we really wanted it, so we were harvesting the plant at a higher moisture than we really wanted to. And so a few things were learned. Number one, we don't harvest as efficiently when it's wet. When it's dry and sunny and nice out, we can do a really nice job at a pretty good rate. When things are wet, a couple things happen. Number one, the bale moisture is a little higher than it should be. Our target number is somewhere in the mid 60s. We pushed the threshold of about 72, 73 last year. The bales will handle it. We just have to adjust pressure accordingly. But we never went below 220, so we were safe there. One of the big things to remember, though, again, is, you know, with the higher moisture, which was a fact of life in farming hemp 2019 season, some of these bales occasionally, especially when you whole plant chop because there's more moisture going into the bale, the whole plant bales had a little more moisture in them, and therefore sometimes there would be a little bit of juice, water juice that comes out. Not best case, but again, the harvest window is what it is. So when we talk about harvesting, there's a few key points that everyone needs to understand as far as timing goes. Timing is so hard because we balance a few things. Number one, are the flowers ready? Number two, are we ready? Are we ready to take in this biomass? Number three, has the government, whichever state you're in, told you that yes, you're approved, you have a certified COA, you've been tested, you've not been tested, whatever the deal is. And then the other big thing is the weather going to cooperate so that we can actually harvest? So those four things are hard enough to line up, let alone having to line up a dryer to take live loads right into, or a processor that's ready to take product right out of the field. To date, we don't have the luxury of being able to pull right out of the field and roll right into a dryer. So baling for us was a huge deal, because now what we've done is we've taken at least the fifth element away from the harvest model. And as I said, it's hard enough to control the four, but that fifth element, being able to go right into the dryer, in 2019 wasn't an option. It was really a difficult thing, unless you owned the dryer and controlled the time management of the dryer. We didn't work for too many people that that gave us that option. So again, a lot of things to consider. It's a very difficult task to harvest anything anyway, especially with conditions we had in 2019. But keep in mind, timing and planning for the time to harvest is so critical. It is a make or break. You can do everything else right the whole season. You can have beautiful bushy plants stacking 16 points of oil, top bud, doing everything that you read in the books and you listen to in webinars, etc., etc. And if you don't harvest and handle your material right prior to processing, all of that was for naught. So make sure that you really have a good, solid harvest plan in place before you move forward.